Greetings. We're still early September 30 AD. So, this subtext is Jesus in Ramoth Gilead. We are Tuesday, September 5th, 30 AD, 18th of Elul. From Aenon, Jesus went with 12 disciples, not the 12, to the Jabbok and the neighboring places. Andrew, James, John, and some other disciples remained in Aenon in order to baptize at the pool of baptism east of the hill. The water ran from the hill into the baptismal basin, formed a little lake behind it, watered some meadows as a little brook, and then fell into a reservoir on the north of Aenon, from which it could be turned at pleasure into the Jordan. I saw Jesus with the disciples teaching in a city about 1 hour east of Sukkoth and on the south side of the Jabbok. Among the numerous sick that was healed was a man who, since his birth, had one eye closed. Jesus moistened it with his saliva. The eye opened, and the man enjoyed perfect sight. Jesus crossed the Jabbok, which flows through a valley, and turned to the east until he came into the vicinity of Mahanaim, a nice clean city in 2 sections. He sat down by the well outside, and soon came out the elders of the synagogues and the chief men of the cities with goblets, food, and drink. They bade Jesus welcome, washed his and his disciples' feet, poured ointment on Jesus' head, gave him and the disciples a little luncheon, and conducted him with great love and simplicity into the city. Jesus delivered a short discourse upon the patriarch Jacob, and of all that had happened to him in those parts. Most of these people had been baptized by John. A patriarchal simplicity reigned in all the cities around this region, and many of the ancient customs were still observed. Jesus did not tarry long here, only time enough to receive the honors paid him on this route. From Mahanaim, he went along the northern bank of Jabbok for about 1 hour eastward to the place where Jacob and Esau met. The valley here sinks deep. During the whole way Jesus taught his disciples. Around some time they crossed again to the southern bank, not far from where 2 little streams united to form the Jabbok. Then they continued their journey for about 1 mile to the east, with the desert of Ephron on their right. After traversing the valley, they found upon a mountain ridge to the east of the forest of Ephron, Ramoth Gilead, a beautiful city, clean and regularly built. In it, the pagans had their own quarter and temple. The sacred services were celebrated by Levites. One of the disciples went on ahead to announce Jesus' approach. The Levites and other men of distinction were already awaiting him in a tent near the well outside the city. They washed the newcomers' feet, gave them the usual refreshments as a pledge of hospitality, and conducted them into the city. There, they found the crowd of poor sick gathered on an open square to implore Jesus' help. He cured many of them. That evening he taught in the synagogue, for it was the beginning of the Sabbath that commemorated the sacrifice of Jephthah's daughter, which in this city was celebrated as a mourning and national festival. That's mourning as in sad. There were crowds of young maidens and other people from the country around. Jesus and the disciples took a repast with the Levites and stayed overnight in a house near the synagogue. There were in these parts no special inns prepared for Jesus. In Aenon, Kaman, and Mahanaim, they were hired in advance, and the number of guests limited. Ramoth was built on terraces in a hill behind which, in a little valley flanked by a steep rocky wall, was a quarter of a city inhabited by the pagans. They had a temple. One could always recognize their abodes by the figures erected on the roofs. On the roof of this temple was a whole group. The central figure wore a crown and stood in a reservoir or fountain, holding a basin in his hand. Around it were several figures of children dipping up the water and pouring it from one to another until at last it fell into the basin held by the middle figure. The cities in this region were more beautiful, more neatly built than the old Jewish ones. The streets were laid off in the form of a star, all verging to a central point, and the extremities were rounded, thus making the circumference assume something of a zigzag form. As did also the city walls, like a citadel. Ramoth Gilead was formerly a city of refuge for the criminals. There was a large solitary building in which they were lodged, but at the time of Jesus' visit it had fallen to ruin and appeared to be no longer used. They made tapestry here, embroidered with figures of all kinds of animals and flowers, partly for trade and partly for the use of the temple. I saw numbers of women and young maidens working on it at long tents. The costume of the people resembled more the patriarchal style, and they were very clean. The clothing was of fine wool. Wednesday, September 6th. Jesus assisted at a solemn memorial feast of the sacrifice of Jephthah's daughter. He went with his disciples and the Levites to a beautiful open square outside the city to the east where preparations for the festival had been made. The inhabitants of Ramoth Gilead were already assembled and ranged in large circles. Here were still the hill and the altar upon which Jephthah's daughter was immolated. In front of it was a semicircle of grassy seats for the maidens. Nearby were seats for the Levites and magistrates of the city. All went in for a long and orderly procession to their places. The young girls of Ramoth and many of the neighboring cities assisted at the feast in robes of mourning. One young girl, clothed in white and veiled, personated Jephthah's daughter herself. A troop of others clad in somber robes and their faces veiled to the chin and wearing black fringed sashes on the forearm, represented her lamenting companions. Tiny girls scattering flowers and playing on little flutes mournfully headed the procession in which 3 lambs were led. The ceremonies were long and of the most touching nature. They comprehended different parts, chanting, religious instructions, and representations of the sad drama, while psalms and songs commemorative of it were sung. The maidens that personated Jephthah's daughters were comforted and lamented in chorus by her companions, though she herself was sighing only after death. Among the Levites also, in some of the choirs of singers, there seemed to be held a conference upon the heroine's fate, but she presented herself before them and in earnest words begged to be allowed to accomplish the vow. They made use of different rolls of writing in the different scenes, some parts being recited from memory, others read from the scrolls, or rather read from the rolls. It's almost the same thing. Anyways, as an aside here, Jephthah's daughter, this is referencing the story in Judges when there's a certain judge, Japhteth, who decided to take on the Ammonites and said, if you grant me this victory, I'll sacrifice the next thing that walks through the door. And Jephthah's daughter happened to be what walked through the door, so he immolated her. All right, and I'll get into that later. So, continuing the reading. Jesus took an active part in the celebration. He personated the supreme judge, or high priest, and besides the speeches assigned his role, he delivered instructions before and during the ceremonies. 3 lambs were sacrificed in memory of Jephthah's daughter, their blood sprinkled around the altar, and the roasted flesh given to the poor. Jesus gave the young maidens some words of instruction on the danger of yielding to vanity. I understood from it that Jephthah's, or Jephtias, would have been liberated. I guess that's her name. Would have been liberated had she not been so vain. The feast lasted until afternoon. During the whole celebration, the maidens successively replaced one another, impersonating Japhthes. As soon, and I'm going to make an aside here. I've read the name online. It's Japhthes. I guess they could call her. So this girl would be called Japhthes. I don't know. I just say the names as I read them. Anyways. As soon as one finished her part, the next in order rose from the stone seat upon which she had been sitting in the midst of the circle, retired with her into the tent nearby, and assumed the costume of the victim, that worn by her at the moment of immolation. The tomb of the young heroine was on a neighboring hill, and on it lambs were sacrificed. It was a four-cornered sarcophagus opening on top. When the fat of the lambs and the other portions to be sacrificed were almost consumed, what was left of the victims was introduced slantingly into the opening, that with the ashes it might fall into the tomb. When the lambs were slaughtered, I saw the blood sprinkled around the altar, and the maidens putting with a little rod a drop of it on the end of the long narrow veil hanging over their shoulder. Jesus said, Jephtias, thou shouldst have thanked God in the retirement of thine own home for the victory he had granted thy people, but becoming vain and seeking praise as a hero's daughter, thou didst with frivolous ornaments and festive sounds go forth boasting before the other daughters of the land. When the festive ceremonies were ended, all retired to a pleasure garden nearby where arbors and tents had been erected and an entertainment prepared. Jesus took part in it. He placed himself at the table at which the poor were fed and related a parable. The maidens ate in the same tent, but separated from the others by a screen about 3 feet high. Lying at table, one could not see over it. Though to one standing, it did not obstruct the view. After the meal, Jesus and the Levites, the disciples, and many others returned to the city where numbers of sick were patiently awaiting his coming. He cured them, as well as some lunatics and others afflicted with melancholy. He taught in the synagogue, taking for his subject Jacob and Joseph and the selling of the latter to the Egyptians. He said, one day another also shall be sold by one of his brethren, but he will pardon his penitent brethren, and in the time of famine feed them with the bread of eternal life. On that same evening, some of the pagans outside the city accosted the disciples very humbly, asking them whether they too might hope to share in the great prophet's teaching. The disciples informed Jesus of their desire, and he promised to go to them in the morning. Japhteth was the natural son of an idolatrous mother. In the Bible, she's a whore. Driven by his father's legitimate children from Ramoth, called the Mizpah, he lived in the neighboring land of Tob. He joined some military adventurers and led a life of brigandage, banditry. His pagan wife died young, leaving him an only daughter who was beautiful and extraordinarily talented, but rather given to vanity. Japhteth was an exceedingly rash, absolute, and determined man, eager for victory, and strongly wedded to his own word. He was more like a pagan hero than a Jew. He was an instrument of the hand of God, fired with desire to conquer and rule the land from which he had been expelled. He made that solemn vow to offer to the Lord as a holocaust the first one that should come out of his own house on his victorious return. He dreamed not that it would be his only daughter. As for the rest of his family, he had no love for them. Jephthah's vow was not pleasing to God. Nevertheless, he permitted it, decreeing that its fulfillment should be a chastisement upon both father and daughter, and cut off the posterity of the former from Israel. His daughter would perhaps have been perverted by the success and elevation of her father, but as it was, she did penance during the 2 months and died for God. It is probable that she also influenced her father to a better way of thinking and made him more faithful to God. The daughter went out followed by a long train of maidens with songs and flutes, timbrels to meet her father. It was at a whole hour's distance from the city that she met him. Still, she was the first whom he saw belonging to his own family. When she discovered her misfortune, she entered into herself and asked for a reprieve of 2 months, that she might retire into solitude to prepare by penance for her sacrifice, and to mourn with her companions over her virginal death, which would deprive her father of posterity in Israel. With several of her young companions, she went into the mountains opposite the valley of Ramoth, where for 2 months she dwelt under a tent in prayer, fasting, and sackcloth. The maidens of Ramoth took turns in staying with her. She mourned especially her vanity and thirst for glory. The rulers held counsel as to whether she could be freed from death, but it was not possible since her father had sworn a solemn oath. It was consequently a vow that could in no wise be commuted. I saw too that the daughter herself desired its fulfillment and petitioned for it in words both wise and touching. Her sacrifice was accompanied for every mark of grief, her companions chanting songs of mourning around her. She was seated on the same spot upon which the memorial feast was celebrated. Here again a council was held for the purpose of delivering her from death. But stepping forward, she expressed her wish to die, just as I had seen at the feast. She was clothed in a long white garment that closely enveloped her from the breast to the feet, but from her head to her breast she wore a transparent white veil, to which could only be seen her face, neck, and shoulders. She walked courageously to the altar. Her father hurried from the scene without bidding her adieu. Then she drank something red from a vessel presented her. I think it was something to render her unconscious. One of Jephthah's warriors was deputed to give her the death blow. Her eyes were bandaged as a sign that he did not incur the guilt of murder, since he could not see the blow that was to kill the victim. Oh, interested. Okay. She was then laid on his left arm, and he pierced her throat with a short, sharp weapon. She had no sooner drunk the red liquid than it produced its effect, for she was perfectly unconscious when laid on the warrior's arm. 2 of her young companions, who also were in white and appeared to act as bridesmaids, caught the blood in a dish, poured it on the altar. She was afterward enveloped by her companions in a winding sheet and laid at full length on the altar, the upper surface of which was grated. A fire was kindled below, and when her garments were burned and the whole looked like a blackened mess, some raised the grate with the corpse on it. They rested the grate upon the edge of an open tomb nearby, then gently raising the grate, let the body slide down into it. The tomb was then closed. It was still to be seen, even in Jesus' time. The companions of Japhteth, the girl, and many of the assistants steeped their veils and handkerchiefs in her blood, while others gathered up the ashes of the Holocaust. Before Jephtias made her appearance in her sacrificial habiliments, her young companions had retired with her into a tent where she bathed and was prepared for the ceremony. It was to the north of Ramoth, over 2 hours' distance in the mountains, that Jephtias and her companions met her father. They were mounted upon little asses adorned with ribbons and hung with tinkling bells. One rode in front of Jephtias, one on either side, and the rest followed with songs and music. They sang the canticle of Moses upon the defeat of the Egyptians. As soon as Japhteth descried his daughter, he rented his garments and became inconsolable. Jephtias herself did not give way to grief, but learned with calmness the fate that awaited her. When she and her companions left her father's house for the wilderness, taking with them such food as was allowed for a fast, Japhteth spoke to his daughter for the last time. This was in a certain manner the beginning of the sacrifice. At the moment of parting, he laid his hand, as was customary in offering sacrifice, upon his daughter's head with the simple words, "Go forth, thou wilt never have a spouse." To which she responded, "No, I shall never have a spouse." And he never again spoke to her. After his daughter's death, Japhteth had a beautiful monument erected in Ramoth and a little temple built over it. He ordered a memorial festival to be annually celebrated on the anniversary of his daughter's immolation as a remembrance of his sad vow and a warning to others against such rashness. And here it references Judge 11:39-40. Jephthah's mother was a pagan who had been converted to Judaism. His wife was the daughter of a man born from the illicit union of a Jew with an idolatress. On his expulsion from his native place, the daughter did not accompany him. She remained in Ramoth, where, meanwhile, her mother died. When in time of danger, Japhteth was recalled to Tob by his companions, he did not return into the city of his birth. He assembled the people and concerted measures with them in the camp outside of Mizpah. His own home and his only daughter did not see. When he made that vow, he never thought of her, but of his other relatives who had repudiated him, and therefore God punished him. Thursday, September 7th. The feast lasted 4 days. Jesus, with his disciples, visited also the pagan quarters in Ramoth. The people met him with marks of reverence at the head of their street. Not far from their temple was an open-air space used for public discourses. Several of the sick and aged had been brought thither, the former of whom Jesus healed. They that had solicited a visit from him appeared to be learned men, priests, and philosophers. They knew about the journey of the 3 kings and of their having seen the birth of the King of the Jews in the stars, for they too had a similar expectation and were likewise engaged in the observation of the stars. Not far from here was a kind of observatory similar to that in the land of the holy 3 kings, and from it they gazed at the stars. They had long sighed for instruction, and now they received it from Jesus himself. He spoke to them of very profound mysteries, even of the most holy Trinity. I heard these words that especially astonished me. There are 3 that give testimony, the water, the Spirit, and the blood. And these 3 are one. He spoke of the fall of man, of the promised Redeemer, of the guidance of humankind, of the deluge, of the passage through the Red Sea and the Jordan, and of baptism. He told them that the Jews had not obtained entire possession of the promised land, that many pagans still dwelt therein, but that he was now come to take possession of all that remained and unite it to his kingdom, not, however, by the sword, but by charity and grace. His words made so deep an impression upon many of his hearers that he sent them to Aenon to be baptized. 7 aged men that could no longer travel, Jesus allowed to be baptized at once by 2 of the disciples. A basin was brought and placed before them, while they stood up to the knees in water in a bathing cistern near at hand. Above the basin was placed a railing upon which they could lean. 2 of the disciples laid their hands on the neophytes' shoulders, while Matthias, a disciple of John, poured on their heads one after another water from the shell, at the end of which was a handle. Jesus dictated to the disciples the form of the words they should use. The old men were clothed in beautiful white garments, all very neat and clean. Then Jesus gave an instruction to the people in general, taking for his subject chastity and marriage. To the women he spoke especially of obedience, of humility, and the education of their children. These people were well disposed. They conducted Jesus most affectionately back to the Jewish quarter, where he went to the synagogue and healed the sick that he found before it. The Levites were not well pleased at Jesus' having visited the pagans. In the synagogue, where Jephthah's festival was still being celebrated, Jesus taught of the call of the Gentiles. He said that many of them would rank higher in his kingdom than the children of Israel, and that he has come to unite with the rightful possession of the promised land by grace, instruction, and baptism, the idolaters whom the Israelites had not expelled. He spoke also of Jephthah's victory and vow. While Jesus was preaching in the synagogue, the maidens were celebrating their feast at the monument that Japhteth had erected to his daughter. It had been rebuilt, and every year at the recurrence of the festival was beautified by the contributions of the young girls, probably ornament with flowers and stuff. It stood in a round temple with an opening in the roof. In the center of the temple was a smaller one of the same form. It consisted of a kind of cupola supported by columns, in which one of which was concealed a staircase leading up to it. Around the cupola wound a spiral walk upon which was a representation of the triumphal procession of Japhteth, the figures being the height of the child. This piece of workmanship was of light material, but shining like a polished metal. The base supporting it was of open work, through which the figures appeared to be gazing down into the little temple. The top of the cupola was crowned by a circular metal platform, from which a kind of ladder consisting of a pole with projecting rods on either side led up to the roof of the exterior temple. From this roof, the view over the city and surrounding city was very extended. The platform at the top of the ladder was wide enough to allow two girls holding to a pole to make a turn around it hand in hand. It's an interesting way to describe the space. Anyways, a pedestal in the center of the smaller temple supported a white marble figure of Jephthah's daughter seated on a chair of the same material, just as she appeared before her immolation. Her head reached to the first coil of the spiral-shaped cupola. Around the base of the statue there was space enough for 3 men to walk abreast. The columns surrounded the little temple were connected together by beautiful grates. The exterior was of stone veined in different colors. The coils of the cupola varied in degrees of whiteness from the bottom to the top, to the upper ones of the purest white. In a temple around this monument, the young girls now celebrated Jephtias' feast. The maiden statue held a handkerchief to the eyes with one hand as if shedding tears, while the other, hanging listlessly at her side, held a flower or broken branch. The young girls' celebration was conducted with order. Sometimes they stretched curtains from the outer circle of the temple to the interior of the monument, and took their places in little groups apart to pray and sigh and mourn in silence, their eyes fixed on the statue. Sometimes they sang together in chorus, sometimes in alternate choirs. Again they passed 2 by 2 before the statue, strewing flowers and adorning it with wreaths, as if to console Jephtias, chanting hymns of the shortness of life. I remember the expressions, "Today for me, tomorrow for thee." Then they sang the praises of Jephtias' fortitude and resignation, lauding her highly as the price of their victory. Then they mounted in groups by the serpentine walk up to the top of the cupola, where they sang triumphal songs. Some went to the roof of the exterior temple, looked out over the country as if to catch a glimpse of the conquering hero, and pronounced the fearful vow. The procession then returned, lamenting to the monument, mourned over the young virgin, and consoled her on the privation of the privileges of maternity. The exercises were interspersed with canticles of thanksgiving to God and reflections upon his justice, the various scenes being accompanied by very touching pantomimes, expressive by turns of joy, grief, and devotion. A grand entertainment was prepared for the young girls in the temple. I saw them not reclining at one table, but sitting in tiers of three, one above another, all around the temple with little round tables at their side. They sat cross-legged. They had all kinds of wonderful dishes and delicacies made up into figures, for instance, that of the lamb lying on its back and filled with fruit and other eatables. And that is the end of this reading. All right, so some notes, because this was a rather interesting chapter. Or, they're not chapters, but anyways, reading. So I did a little research, because when you first read Judges, it's a puzzling tale. It's very mysterious. Even the saints, or like the fathers of the church, the doctors and whatnot, like the early church fathers and the doctors, they talk about it, but they couldn't agree unanimously as to what went on, right? So it's a puzzling tale. So I'll just list the many things that can be taken from it. And of course, the text gives us a lot. Like Jesus said, if you didn't have vanity, but that's key. That's very key to interpreting what went on here. So some saints of the church talked about this. St. Augustine agreed that the daughter was actually immolated, burned. What they might not have known is that she was slaughtered before, like a lamb, exsanguinated at the throat, and then put to the fire, like a sacrifice. So, but he agreed that she was immolated. Some others thought that she took on a vow of perpetual virginity. Although they might not be correct, they're correct on a spiritual basis. That when you take on a vow of virginity, you are promised never to be vain, or almost. It's a major act declaring that I am not vain. But let's move on. Spiritually, it amounts to about, okay, it's a strong mystery in the book of Judges, and much has to be contemplated upon the event, because the book of Judges gave us a few doozies to interpret. And I think of the Gilead story where the man butchered his wife and sent her parts to the rest of Israel to say, look, Benjamin is in bed. But anyways, so when you're sizing up a sacrifice, you have a few variables. The first is the virginity. The girl has to be not be known, because the preservation of this thing is like a liquid held intact, held white, held pure, maybe clear. We in our world treat virginity like a thing to be broken, which should help signify how much we have forsaken true religion, which even the pagans of ancient days saw value in. It tells us how stupid we are. The second is the beauty, and this girl was very beautiful. How much of it is generally esteemed by the world, right? And that's what makes this sacrifice valuable. It's encased in a beautiful jar. So it's a pure water encased in a beautiful jar. The third is how precious it is to the person. And we now know that it was very precious to Japhteth. We learn how she was vain, and vanity is spiritually punished by fire. This is very important. This is why what I said, when I said Jesus called out her vanity, this is very important. It needs to burn, that is vanity, because if it is the impure part of the self. It comes from the devil. It comes from original sin. That's why it burns. This is why in their sacrifice, they burn the fat and the guts until nothing is left of them. And we saw that in the text here too. And they create the scent. And notice that when we see vain people fail, we're always laughing about it because it produces a good scent, a good aroma. Fatness, we can then equate to vanity. There's no room for vanity in heaven, which is why Catholics believe in purgatory. In purgation, we rid ourselves of original sin. Now, this is, again, very important. So this daughter was very precious to Japhteth, and he hoped to tempt God, but instead, God tempted him, because you shall not put the Lord thy God to the test. And God tried this man's honor. This is a very important element of that story. He didn't like his relatives, but God knew it in his heart. So his angels did not stop his daughter, who in the act of vanity, wanting to be hailed as the hero's daughter, came out to meet him. Japhteth was a vain man. And we know ipso facto from the fact that he had to go through this experience. Because he was accomplished in his brigandry, so he generally outwitted other men. That's how you become good at being a brigand. Well, having to immolate his daughter probably did a lot of his purgation for his soul, for he mourned her bitterly. Much of God's justice is fulfilled by this single act and single vow. Japhteth honored his vow, which tells us a lot of his character, that though there was a lot of bad, at core there was good. So he was worthy to be a judge. It also tells us that God will raise up people in unexpected places to accomplish his will. Though they may appear bad, they may at core be good. This will be very important to know today when prophetic events start to unfold, because we may see what appears to be some very bad people coming against us, but at core, they will be accomplishing God's will. So, on top of all that, the people commemorated this event, which was to its maximum profit. This thing happened in the time of Judges, which was over 1,000 years before that. And they still commemorated the event. Think of how the maidens profit from this. How the maidens of that little town would cleanse themselves of their vanity just because of this one girl's sacrifice. This is the importance of saints in the Catholic Church. This is why we have them. This is why we remember them. This is why we have feast days, because it affects us. It allows their sacrifice to help us rid ourselves of original sin. So, mysteries are like meals, and the mystery of this event is a very big meal that are too big for our mouths, and so we, like serpents ourselves, because of original sin, we unhinge our jaws to try to consume them. And in doing so, we become wiser. Be wise as the serpent. But if we dismiss the meal or make presumptions about it, we lose ourselves. We declare to this world that the mystery is too small. Not that the mystery is too small. The mystery remains its size, but we ourselves diminish. We are too small to comprehend the mystery. We cannot allow it to elasticize us. So I think of virgin sacrifice, of course. Many of the saints of the church, the females, undertook lives of extreme penance. A lot of the women who became saints in the church were of reputed beauty. But the one that was immolated, a lot of them were sentenced to fire. But I found an astonishing thing here. A lot of the female saints were sentenced to fire, but fire wouldn't burn them, or things would happen that would prevent fire from touching them, which lends to them not having any vanity. So instead, they were stabbed or beheaded by their enemies. In one case, masticated. That's nasty. But in these cases, they were killed by their enemies. Saint Joan of Arc was actually immolated, condemned as a heretic, and her life was sort of a holocaust. But where the betraying bishop that put her to death thought he was doing this because France was stepping out of line and he was a patriot, what he actually did was outed himself as the venom, the poison. So he burned her, but he actually, in the history books, we burn him as a betrayer. So her life was given as a holocaust to cleanse not just France, but the church. She had no vanity, but her sacrifice is of even greater value because she gave her life for us. On the theme of mystery, we enter a very important point when Jesus talks to the pagans. Note that these were like astrologers, like the three magi, and gazing up at the nighttime sky, we see something so mysterious that it even baffles our contemporary astronomers. But they were doing, but ours are doing it wrong because they're all empiricists. They all believe in silly origin stories like Big Bang. These pagans looked at it and tried to find the truth. So they accepted that the stars are mysterious. So they contemplate the stars. When you gaze up in open contemplation, you will eventually get your answers. Where when you gaze up in closed-minded presumption, you tell everyone what they are, but you do not know yourself, and you trap them all and yourself in your vanity. The pagans showed very little vanity, while we know that the Israelites left a job unfinished, as Jesus said, because they were continuously harassed in the Old Testament by their enemies who were within Canaan. When we think of the Philistines as a chief example, but there were others. Christ looked at these people like friends. Why? Because they opened their mouths to consume him, did not presume what he was, and he feeds them. This is why the church is universal. Anyone whom opens their mouth for Christ to feed is welcome in the church. The Eucharist is still this today, the ultimate mystery, and the reason we should receive it reverently so as to say we have no vanity. But, well, the church is not letting people do that. Why? Well, that's something for you to contemplate. Ave Maria.